I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
Through the gates of majestic Mount Rome, down to the far corners of the Endless Highway. Wherever you are, welcome to the show. Paranoid American, good day, sir. How are you?
Good day. You are a gentleman and a scholar, as always.
Thank you. I'm in the presence of a gentleman myself, so I might as well act like one. I'm excited to talk about this godfather figure of alchemy today. This is one of these icons of history. You know, people know the name, but do they know the man, really? Maybe.
And do they even know what the name means? Because what the name means in itself is a really cool story.
Yes. Well, if we could touch on that real quick, that'd be cool, because we might as well just blast off with that. I mean, I see that name change. So he was born Philip von Hohenheim, and he changed his name to Paracelsus. And I see that name change like almost like an artist or a rapper would do today. Like an artistic move, right?
That, and a little bit like a diss track, because his name was an insult to like his, sort of villain anti-rapper.
Yeah. It means equal to or greater than Celsius.
There's Celsus, who was a Roman medic.
Oh.
He was sort of the Fauci, right? Imagine that someone came out and they just called themselves Doctor Better Than Fauci. That's kind of what Paracelsus was doing. He came out on the scene and he was like, I'm just going to call myself, like, don't worry about my name. My name is Better Than Fauci. That's what my name is. And that just kind of stuck.
Okay. I'm already learning stuff. I thought that he was talking about like an element or a degree of element, or like a degree.
No, so Celsus
Temperature.
represented the current medical establishment of the day, at least in Rome. So that was his way of just saying, like, I'm bucking the system, which is kind of his thing. That was sort of what Paracelsus did his entire life, was the opposite of what people talked about. He's kind of the father of toxicology in an interesting way. And he's also the one that kind of he gets so much credit for things where it's hard to pigeonhole it and be like, he's the one guy that did it. It's not that clean and cut, you know what I mean? But he did have this very forward thinking where he was at least 2 centuries ahead of his time, where he was using opium as a painkiller. He was using different plants and drugs that everyone else was terrified of because they thought it was poison or toxic. And he realized, he has some quote that's something that the toxin is the dose, or the medicine is the dose. And this idea that, yeah, you can OD on something really easily, but if you take just enough of it, then it can actually have some helpful component. And that was so far ahead of his time that you would go and tell someone, be like, oh, don't worry, just eat this poison that you've seen people die eating, but just take a little tiny bit and it's actually good for you. And they'd be like, yo, this guy is crazy.
Yeah. Even down to the name change. That must have been a revolutionary thing for him, because I think he saw himself as someone who would bring about great change, to a point where it was annoying to be around him sometimes, from accounts from people who worked with him. I mean, he saw himself as this person who would be a revolutionary, and maybe he was a narcissist, or maybe he knew the power of the information that he was working with, or maybe both.
Well, hear me out. Just as a thought experiment, not as like a serious consideration, but just operate under the premise that he was a time traveler. Like he came from the future and he knew that like I've got this at least 200 to 300 years of knowledge from the future that I'm bringing back. They're not going to get it. I am going to be ostracized.
Mm.
So I could almost see that similar thing. Now, if you take the fantasy aspect out, like if there's no sci-fi and there's no time travel, it is possible that his brain was just operating 200 years ahead of time. That happens to a lot. Nikola Tesla would be a really great example where maybe even right now in 2024, we're waiting for people to catch up to whatever the hell he was smoking in the
Hmm.
early, 20th century.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Tesla. Also, I mean, I think this Paracelsian story has grown to accommodate other big thinkers like that, other alchemists and scientists even. I think he virtually influenced everyone. And names like Tesla come to mind, and Victor Schauberger and Rudolf Steiner. I think, and many, many more. And I think they were, even if indirectly, influenced by Paracelsus. I think he had such a huge ripple effect. I know he had an influence on Johannes Kelpius,
I
which I
think
might touch on later. But
well, what makes Paracelsus stand out a lot to me is that if even if you aren't into philosophy or any of like the ethereal spiritual stuff, if you just look at his accomplishments and his way of thinking to the regular mundane world, physics and toxicology and even body chemistry and even regular chemistry, he was actually onto something. He wasn't just a flash in the pan. He wasn't like
mm,
a forgive maybe a bad analogy. He wasn't just like a Nostradamus that just kind of like fired in all directions his whole life. And then people were like, oh, yeah, he was right about this and that. And then forget about all the things he was wrong about. Paracelsus obviously has a lot of that because he's got stories about monsters and like
yeah.
there it gets into like Eye of a Newt kind of vernacular for some of his stuff. And that might be in code. I think some of it might also be maybe a little bit literal just because
Mhm.
he was a trailblazer. He was trying new stuff out. But I think that that's what makes him unique is that he's got real practical effects that even a non-woo-woo person could be like, damn, he really like he was really that far ahead of his time. And now if you consider, which this part is factual, is that he seemed like he was way more spiritual than anything. It was almost like
Mhm.
he was finding his inspiration and his method of thinking in some other realm, or at least in a very philosophical context, and then was taking whatever he was learning about himself there and then applying it to the mundane world.
Mhm.
So I think that it goes so deep. So everything that he talked about with the doses, the toxin, that kind of came from a place of spiritual or philosophical thinking. And that's where it gets really interesting. And that's where his influence, I think, can be felt just as much, if not more. Because we're talking literally talking about the guy that discovered that you could use opium as a painkiller and no one used it for another 250 years after he made that discovery. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
like
yeah.
he was so far ahead of his time on things that we consider to just be basic nature in medicine, but I mean that's a development over the last 150 years or so.
Yeah. The spiritual aspect of this definitely caught my eye. And also his belief in these planetary spirits called Olympic spirits, who seem to be akin to Anunnaki, but they're also, or archons maybe, but they're different from those entities in other ways. But I think for me, if you think of alchemy as an ancient technology that includes magic, Paracelsus and what he did might make more sense in that spiritual sense almost, because he was all about it. And I know it's a kind of a bold recommendation to kind of see this through a spiritual lens, but I haven't been able to study Paracelsus without bumping up against this supernatural side of alchemy. So I think this could quickly turn into a conversation about magic
Well,
and
he's
about the
also
supernatural.
he's a forefather of the concept of homunculi, right? Of like creating
Yes.
a little homunculus. which maybe there's a non-secular, maybe there's like a non-spiritual way to look at a homunculus, but I don't see there being any way that it can't have some kind of a woo-woo component to it. Because all a homunculus really is a nice little attractive trap that you're setting for to entice a soul into, or at least, you're it's a thing that doesn't have a spirit to it, and then you're using some sort of supernatural fill in the blank to make it a real boy. This is the fairy godmother coming down in Pinocchio and actually giving him consciousness from, and I guess Paracelsus is sort of like Geppetto and the fairy godmother all together in one. And it's
Hmm.
hard to separate those two things because even in stories like Pinocchio, like it's harder to imagine one role that does all those different things. So they kind of split it up so everything can represent itself. And again, Paracelsus was more than a Renaissance man. Like he was like Leonardo da Vinci, like maybe squared or something.
Exactly. He was right on tier with those guys, and he was rumored to go to Egypt. And all these thinkers like Da Vinci, Crowley, Napoleon, they all took these ascension trips to Egypt because it's like this supercharged mystery land. And if you're going to be a Renaissance man, you're going to be that on that intellectual level, you go to Egypt, right? And if anywhere there is to be a real homunculus, it's Egypt. I think they they have a homunculus there. It goes back to the Book of the Dead, where they prepare the homunculi to come to life uh, in the afterlife, essentially. So you die and you're buried with your little. It's called a ushabi, I think. Um, you die, you pass away. Even people that weren't pharaohs, people like almost like everyday common Egyptians would create these things. They're like little dolls, little homunculus dolls, and they look like little pharaohs, and they were to be placed in the burial tomb. And of course, they're said to come alive in the afterlife to help serve the deceased. So, and the Egyptians were alchemists. I mean, there's a case to be made that alchemy has its roots in Egypt, the land of
Kemet.
Kim, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yes. And I think their version of this homunculi, which I don't hear talked about much, is very interesting. They were doing way more than just building extravagant tombs. There's a science and technology to what they did. And I just wonder if there's a intersection there between Paracelsus going to Egypt and the legend of the homunculus.
I wouldn't doubt it. I think I might be incorrect. This is just my own impression after reading a bunch of his work, but I'm by far from any sort of expert on any of this. But one of the things that keeps standing out about Paracelsus to me is that it lacks some of the bippity boppity boo, and you got to do this with pure heart and all that. It almost seems that his approach was that if you follow this formula, if you do these things when I say, how I say, then it works every time. And it kind of lowers that barrier to entrance so that, like you were just saying, it doesn't necessarily require a pharaoh in order to have a homunculus or to do any of these other feats that he claimed that you could do. Because there was also some claims made either by Paracelsus himself or by others that kind of followed in his footsteps on some of the things that he mentioned. But the idea of Paracelsian monsters, the idea of not just creating a homunculus for the fun of it and for saying like, oh, I created life, what a fun experiment, but that you could then take the blood or the entrails or the fingernails or the eyeballs or like all these different components of that homunculus and use that for, and here that's where it would get supernatural. But at no
Mhm.
point do I ever recall reading over the works Paracelsus notes that it's like, oh, and you have to be pure of heart. Oh, and you have to have done all these magical rituals, in some other plane of existence or none of that, which seems to be present in almost every other kind of Eastern philosophy taken by the West, right? Almost all those are like, oh, you've got to be initiated and you have to be like, you have to be properly sort of uh started to in order to even understand or comprehend. And the way that Paracelsus wrote it, if you could go through his deciphering, because it does seem like some of the things were either encoded or he just had funny names for like things to obscure it from people from not getting themselves in trouble. But again, there was no magic. You don't have to like summon a demon as much in this Paracelsian stuff.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it depends on what book you're reading, of course, but I'm with you. Some of the books certainly, and he has a weird way of going about the summoning of these entities too. So, but as far as magic goes broadly, I think it's been said that Paracelsus contributed to magic more than John Dee. And I
Well,
do,
John Dee had a big library and he studied and he read works of a lot of other people and he was sort of an expert in it. But I don't know. And I mean, Enochian magic, I guess, gets credit to him very
mhm,
much, which is developing a technology, but he's developing a technology within an entire field of study. And it's almost like Paracelsus invented the field of study more so than any
yeah,
specific technology within it.
yeah, yeah. So for sure, I think we're at a crossroads here with magic, alchemy, uh, medicine as well, because he supported the notion that doctors should study magic, including black magic, to diagnose illness. Um, so for me, it's broad. Like what where if John Dee was spending all his time on one narrow sort of study, Paracelsus was all over the board, and he was almost, he was a godfather for some of this stuff, and also for me, this ties into German mysticism, which goes way back in history. And lately, I've been studying German occultism and how it essentially has changed the world we live in. And Paracelsus is a guy who would often lecture in German rather than Latin, which was
Well, again, that was
controversial.
like a fu to the establishment.
Yeah.
He was denying establishment on every single direction
Yes.
too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the another thinking at the time was the what was it, like the humors, like being of good humor, and humor was like bile and blood and phlegm and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, "Oh, that's nonsense. It's actually sulfur and salt." And like these other,
Mm-hmm.
he had like another four elements that he was sort of pushing, but was taking, I think, like a really primitive version of biochemistry. Like he kind of had that in mind versus the humors, which again, it's really hard to pin him down because that's one of those examples where I think that he shies away from everything being woo woo. Yes, he's summoning demons, but there's like a scientific method to his madness. Like he's doing it for a reason, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to this is what the books have always told us. Because that was his thing. He was like, I don't care what the books tell me. I don't care what the authorities tell me. Like I've got this other intuition on how everything works.
Yeah. And his doctrine was somewhat, for the time, accessible to the common man because he was willing to speak in German. But
Hmm.
it's also more esoteric and mystical than the common man at the time was prepared to digest. So either way, I see him as part of this German Austrian thread of occultism that I'm starting to find stretches throughout history from the Edomites all the way up to Rudolf Steiner. And it's always just kind of ever present in the background. But Paracelsus is like this huge beacon that really gets things going. That this revolution kind of exists alongside the Renaissance in some type of way, and it's almost like a storm is brewing, and it's all magical and alchemical. And as far as I do want to throw this in too, because I want to get your thoughts on this. As far as his personal life goes, I'm not sure if he was a very sober individual. So some accounts say that he was always drinking and he wouldn't go 2 hours without a drink. So, if that's true, like that might have something to do with why he died at the age of 48. Or there might be a more esoteric lean to this too, because we're talking about someone who thought that frequency could be used to peer into other realms. So I also wonder if he was using alcohol as a way to like thin the veil. That's just speculation. But also, when he died, they tested his bones and he had high level of mercury in his bones, as if he was taking that for some reason as well. So
Well, he definitely was. Dude, he 100%, because part of his thinking, which was groundbreaking, but also maybe fatal, was that it was sulfur, mercury, and salt, and that a combination of those things could cure most ailments. And he was right on a lot of it, right? Like zinc,
mhm.
you could treat wounds with. I think that's like, if you cut your face sometimes, you get like little zinc tablets and stuff that'll like uh help the blood coagulate a lot quicker. But also, I think that he was using mercury to treat syphilis, and it worked. Like, 100% it worked, and it was one of the first things that didn't involve bippity boppity boo and praying to Jesus to get rid of this, the syphilis. But again, like, you probably don't want to be like, even if it kills the syphilis, it's also being toxic to you. And that's
Mhm.
where his whole, the dose is the toxin mentality came in. But yeah, would not surprise me if he was absolutely filled with mercury, because he would be doing that all the time on himself.
Yeah, the tox report was wild. He had
Well,
high
and
levels of mercury.
and there's also a lot of speculation that when they analyzed his skeleton, I guess his hips, like his hip bones, were wide like a woman's. So there's a lot of speculation that he might have been intersex, or that might have even been another, battle rapper coming a little later on and throwing shade at him. It's
Yeah,
it's really
yeah.
hard to separate those things now.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I didn't go super deep into the medical aspect of Paracelsus. I looked at that a little. I mainly was, I guess I was just kind of taken off guard by some of this more extravagant stuff, like just the more shocking stuff about his life. And also, I found myself in this realm of Paracelsian lore as it pertains to elementals and elementary spirits. I find that fascinating. And I came across this book in particular. It's called the Arabatel. It's a very interesting text that's associated with Paracelsus, and it seems to appear in Basel in 1575. Of course, Paracelsus lived in Basel, and he went to the University of Basel. He taught there some. It's this kind of a quaint, very old city that's on the Rhine. It's at the corner of France, Germany, and Switzerland. It's just a fascinating place for this book to mysteriously come out of. But Paracelsus and his circle seem to be the only people to have found the book and brought it out into the light. Other than that, it's like I say, it's mysteriously, it's got mysterious origins, but it's a very unique text. It's called Arabatel and the Magic of the Ancients. In the book, Paracelsus himself is mentioned alongside Hermes and the Apostle Paul. This is where things get interesting, though. Have you heard about this book?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Uh, it says the cosmos are divided into 186 provinces, and those provinces are governed by these entities called Olympic spirits. According to the book, the age that we're in now would be the age of Ophiel, who is an Olympic planetary spirit of Mercury. Ophiel is associated with our very fast modern communication methods on Earth. He's associated with the way we're able to podcast and how we're able to have this conversation right now. Actually, he governs for a period of 490 years, and then a different Olympic steps in. Paracelsus, in his own writings, mentions these spirits. He mentions other similar spirits as well, to the point where it's almost as if he had a part in writing this book. But beyond that, these spirits are said to be able to cure sickness and extend life. So there's that medical angle like slipping back in here. And like I think I said earlier, the Olympic spirits remind me a lot of like archons or Anunnaki, but they're just a little different. But they're like these galactic guardian entities. And in Paracelsus' writings, it seems that contact with them includes working with this pantheon of smaller entities as well, who are very fairy-like, very much like mythological cryptids. They're so you have this contrast here between these higher entities that are out in the cosmos governing, and then you have these earth-based entities, and the earth-based entities are nymphs, dryads, sylphs, and pygmies. So in some of Paracelsus' more obscure writings and in the Arabatel, you find teachings on how to summon these elemental spirits. And there's also Paracelsus was, from what I can tell, like totally believed in this stuff. And he also believed in undines and gnomes and salamanders. So there's this whole pantheon of entities. Salamanders is interesting because that's connected to like Native American water babies, but this gets into cryptids and fairy lore.
And
So,
this is exactly where I wonder how much, because I know that he was, in my mind, he was first and foremost a doctor. At least that was his outward profession. That was the reason that he would travel around the countryside, but he kind of used that as his way to get into a whole bunch of random cliques. It's almost the same way that there's so many damn cop shows, but the reason there's cop shows is because who else but a police officer has the authority to like interject themselves into a million different scenarios and a whole bunch of different lines of work and businesses and social classes, like any other profession, aside from maybe also doctors, right? They also get to intersect and sort of like interact with all these different classes and scopes of people. Whereas if you're like a librarian, you're just dealing with one kind of person. If you're a teacher, you're dealing with one age type of a person, right? So Paracelsus, I think, in a way, like him being a medical doctor served as that reason for him to travel all over and integrate with all different types of people. And then as he's doing this, he's learning constantly about new folklores of these regions, and he's being able to put these things together the same way. If you travel to Egypt and you come back, you're like, oh, I know what you're talking about. Like Simpsons did it, but like his Simpsons is Egypt, and he knows what that original reference is, so he can connect the dots more. So I think that he's learning about all this folklore stuff, and he's applying it to his regular medical practice, which is constantly improving because of these influences. But somewhere in between, he's literally taking folklore and turning it into practical medicine. But that
yes.
also means that he might be supplanting certain discoveries that he's making and saying like, oh, that was a salamander, or that was a fairy or a gnome or a pygmy, and it might really be something else, or it might be something related. For example, imagine if whenever he said a fairy, it could have just meant like a certain kind of flower or a certain kind of mushroom, or that's a pretty standard practice that they would do. But also, he definitely believed in monsters and supernatural fairies and stuff, because that was one of the outcomes of a homunculus. If you let a homunculus grow too long and you didn't either keep it in check or kill it at a certain point, it would eventually morph into what I guess we would consider right now as cryptids, or like some weird thing that goes bump in the night. Those all would have originated from some sort of homunculus that just uh grew outside of its normal bounds.
Well, he was talking to miners who had apparently contacted some of these beings within the earth. So, in a way, he was into cryptids, like researching. It was like he was referencing experience or accounts, and he was going out and seeking after this folklore, yes, and real life encounters with this stuff. I thought that was crazy. I mean, the story of the miners reminded me, this is a little off topic, but it reminded me of this guy who created the first supercomputer, the Seymour Cray. Because he said that he was digging tunnels in his backyard and said he was talking to elves in the tunnels who were in turn helping him build his computer.
Sounds like Snow White too. That's the
So,
plot of Snow White.
yeah. So I'm thinking like, is Paracelsus, is he searching this information to in turn get knowledge in some type of way from the other side? But he mentioned these earth-based beings alongside of these beings connected to the cosmos, and other magical texts also coming out of Basil also talk about the process of Enoch being turned into an angel. So all these texts combined for me point to there being some type of a neighboring realm that these guys believed in. I mean, the book goes very deep. It seems to point to these sigils, these geometric lines that are like a set of keys to doors to the other side. And it's something I've been seeing more and more, where it's like this forgotten language of sacred geometry that's been lost to modern man. And I keep bumping up against that.
Well, and you mentioned Basil a few times. So he
Mm-hmm.
was a teacher there while he was kind of releasing some of these works. But another interesting place where he intersects with the regular old real world of normies, he ends up burning Galen's works, the guy that came up with the Four Humors. He
Mm-hmm.
burns that dude's books while he was there and gets
Mm-hmm.
chased out of town. They're like, yo, this guy is out of control. So he gets chased out of Basel because of his not just disagreeing, but he was basically saying, my thinking is so superior. This is so out of date that it's gonna harm you. I need to get rid of this information and kind of replace it with my own. So he wasn't just like this nerd in the corner summoning homunculi on his free time and then
Mm-hmm.
kind of like waiting for people to come to him. He was a very strong advocate of this. And I guess the same thing you mentioned before, that people maybe didn't get along with them for long periods of time. And you can kind of imagine this is the kind of guy that'll just walk up into a university and start setting fires because he is such a, is it count as narcissist if he's right though? You know what I mean? Like
That's
if
what
he
I was thinking too. Yeah,
like that,
it's
and that's why I said time traveler before, just because the idea that a time traveler minus the sci-fi aspect, but they're right. You know what I mean? They're not just, they didn't have some random vision. They're like, I feel that this is how the world works. Like they might, time traveler might actually be like, no, this is objectively how this works. So they've
mm-mm.
got the truth on their side, but it would still seem like they're just grasping at straws if you were being affected by them.
Burning books. He's causing a stir.
He's
He's
doing drugs.
doing drugs. He's he's like contacting a wide variety of entities, apparently, according to some of these texts.
Well, and
And
he's the guy that you invite after the orgy, and they're like, "Yo, let's heal all these people that have got syphilis now." So like, he's seen everything. He's seen the inside of, like concubine harem sort of orgy rooms. He's been underground talking about cryptids with minors. He's out in the forest by himself picking, weird mushrooms and like beating the carcass of animals for magical reasons. Like he's literally doing everything you can imagine.
on top of all that, he's a diehard devout Christian. Like, if
Well, I
this
feel like
isn't
there's a
weird
huge
enough.
asterisk in that too, though.
Yeah, yeah. There's it's Christian alchemical occultism, but no one really wants to admit that that's a thing. And I don't think they did back then either. I gather that people on both sides didn't want this information to be known. I think Christians and non-Christians did not like this stuff because it challenged, it threatened the church, and it challenged and threatened the secular state. And it's interesting to see how some of this knowledge to this day has been systematically uprooted out of Christianity over time. There's not a trace of this. These, because at one time, these guys, John D. Paracelsus, their followers, they were asterisk devout Christians who believed that you could summon a wide variety of these entities and do all this other stuff. I mean, there's what comes with that too is a degree of persecution for their beliefs. And it seems like Paracelsus was dealing with authority big time, like the man, the church, big brother, even like medieval big pharma. And in many ways, I see him as relatable to anyone trying to escape the matrix today because he challenged the status quo. And I think he faced censorship from these establishment overlords who wanted to keep everything dumbed down. You know, the people, we can't have this information getting out. We can't have this knowledge getting out, getting into the hands of the people. Knowledge is power. That's what I think this guy was cooking with. So it goes back to the question of, is he a narcissist, or does he realize the potency of this knowledge? And that censorship continued in the years after his death. I mean, his followers faced censorship and oppression for these same beliefs.
Well, and what you're describing too about, or I mentioned Christianity with a big asterisk.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's sort of a proto Rosicrucian. This is before Rosicrucianism even exists by at least a century. Because I think Rosicrucianism was 17th century, and Paracelsus dies in like the 1500s, mid
Mm-hmm.
1500s. So he's at least a century and a half away from this. And if anything, the Rosicrucians might have said, okay, well, Paracelsus was onto something, but it didn't turn out great for him. Either he died from eating all the mercury, which I think is valid. Like it's not worth just completely setting that one aside because the dude was just straight up taking mercury to the dome all the time. Just
Apparently,
little bits.
drinking.
Right, yeah, but there's also speculation that he was taken out, which would make sense because
Mm-hmm.
he had amassed so many powerful enemies. But I think
Mm-hmm.
by the time Rosicrucians came around enough to form like a whole little society around it, at that point it was kind of secretive because look what happened to homie Paracelsus.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of influences like a modern version of the Rosicrucians. So I kind of when you say that he was a Christian, I think like Rosicrucian maybe is a better
Sure.
word. It just didn't exist for him at that time. He would have been a party of one, I think. Like it would just been he was the only one in that society.
Mm-hmm. Well, and two, I've went back and I've read some of his writings, which that's a hairy topic because a lot of his writings may not have been written by him. But I went to some of the writings that we definitely think he wrote, and I skimmed through some of that, and I looked at this Arabatel of magic book that he followed, and in there is some indication that he was, by by all standards, a devout Christian, in the sense that he thought that you could do magic and alchemy in the name of God, and that's how you should approach it. You should approach it through prayer with the blessing of the Almighty. I see that thread through this, and I see that in his followers too. So that's another indication that these guys, to some degree, were about being Christians on top of all this. I mean, one of his followers who stuck out to me is Johannes Kelpius. He was from Transylvania in Romania, which is, that caught my eye because that's where my family actually came to America from. Some of my family, I have a grandfather who moved over here from Transylvania. But anyway, Kelpius goes to Germany, and this is in the late 1600s, to study theology at a time when these new forms of Christianity and Protestantism are emerging. And these are forms of Christianity that are heavily influenced by the esoteric. Basically, they're being driven by the work of Paracelsus. And he becomes this godfather of this religious revolution. They called it pietism. But Kelpis is a true follower. He's wrapped up in the movement. And the more I looked into this movement, the more I found that, frankly, this is like this punk rock, alchemically occult version of Christianity. Even though they do magic and contact entities, they still consider themselves Christians. So through this movement, Paracelsus, in many ways, is responsible for bringing astrology and alchemy into this strange sect of Christianity. And I found a quote from Kelpis. He said, later in life, in a moment of reflection, he said of this time, for many university students in Germany at the time, participation in pietism led them to witness strange things of the invisible world. I love that. That got me kind of fired up because I'm all about investigating the invisible world. It's my gig.
And maybe I just like tend to err towards the most mundane of explanations and extrapolate from there. So in the 1500s or even the 1600s, the invisible world very much could have been mixing two different chemicals together and seeing a reaction and
Mm-hmm.
being like, wow, something came in the room and did this, right? Like that's the invisible world, just like microbiology didn't necessarily exist either, but that was also something that he kind of advocated for, where I don't I don't know exactly how well it correlates, but he kind of had this belief that diseases were spiritual, so that
Yeah.
if you had some malignant sort of condition that and what does that mean when you say, like every disease is a spiritual thing, which I think is like a loose quote of one of his. Does that mean that we're talking Scientology thetans? You know what I mean? Like your
Yeah.
body's filled with all these thetans that you have to go clear?
Yeah.
Or could it be like a mental thing? Because there wasn't really a clear way of discussing mental health at this point.
Right.
So the version of mental health could also be, this spiritual thing. Because what else would it be other than your spirit has some sort of condition? Which I don't know. It's because I heard this one thing one time that I guess changed my understanding, especially of Christianity, but that every 50 years, Christianity, regardless of all the rules, and especially even in like Catholicism, but every 50 years, it kind of radically changes. Not so much that there's a huge event and they're like, all right, we're changing the rules up, we're shaking things up to make it interesting. But it's just that if you were to take someone that was taught something for 50 years and then you have them meet someone that lived a generation or two generations removed, the different things that are accepted are almost incompatible. Imagine all the things that are accepted in modern day Catholicism, for example, and you go back 100 years and you're like, here's what we're allowed to do today. It would seem grossly incompatible, almost as if they were completely different denominations. And I think that probably has applied since forever.
Mm-hmm. You know that diseases or illnesses are spiritual, man. That just kind of, I don't know. I don't even know what that means. It's super broad, but I do know that there's a tinge of mysticism to this Paracelsian pietism because they did kind of dip their toes in the woo woo. They sought after the ability to achieve mild telepathy for starters. It's like I don't know if they actually thought that they could send thoughts to each other's minds, but they had some they I think it was like reading the vibes of a room. Like, you can go into a room and you can kind of feel if people in that room are sad or happy or anxious or whatever. I think they were taking that concept and trying to run with it and trying to go deeper into telepathy. But, you know,
Right, because the concept by its name, micro expressions didn't exist yet, and body language analysis didn't exist yet. Those were things that didn't get names for another few centuries. But
mhm,
if you were well versed in those things without it having an entire sort of like field of study dedicated to it, then it's easy to kind of group it all into just telepathy.
yeah. So there's that woo woo stuff that kind of goes over my head. My eyes kind of glaze over. But I also respect these guys because they were revolutionaries and they were standing up for their beliefs and they were challenging the status quo. And they were, through their work and study and dedication, they were almost like demanding change. They were like young, hopeful, and wanted real change. Back to Kelpius, he and his friends were being looked at like radicals for doing this sort of dance with this occult Christian practice with alchemy and mysticism and all that thrown in there. They were under the threat from all governments everywhere except for one place, which was interestingly enough Pennsylvania here in the US, because at the time the state of Pennsylvania had the loosest laws on religious practice, so it attracted these guys to come over. This is what I read. Apparently in 1694, Johannes Kelpis and a group of Paracelsius followers came to Pennsylvania So
That doesn't sound crazy to me, but I've also been inundated with this stuff for so long. But there's another line of thinking that I've got a full bias on this, so I'm not even going to pretend like I'm not biased on it. But that America or the Americas, if you were just to say from the top of Canada to the tip of Argentina or Chile, right? But the Americas could potentially have actually been the ground zero for all of this, all culture, all ways of thinking, religion, technology, and it's spread out from there because so many people look at Americas as, oh my God, how did the Vikings get here? How did the Chinese get here? Like, how did all of these symbols show up or make themselves known in Europe when we don't think that anyone came here until Columbus or Amerigo Vespucci or fill in the blank, which wouldn't have been until way after some of these references are found. But there's another explanation. If everything came from here and went out, then it doesn't require an explorer to have visited the Americas and then returned home to spread the message. All they had to do was bring that information with them the first time that their ancestors left that sort of like original land for whatever reason. I'm
mhm.
not saying that that has any sort of academic credentials that it's rooted in, but it's a fascinating area of thinking. And also, there seems to be a woefully inadequate amount of archaeology or even interest of archaeology in sort of like the ancient mounds in
Yeah.
America versus how much attention Göbekli Tepe gets, or ancient Egyptian ruins get, or ancient Greek temples get. Like they're all worthy of investigation, right? But
Yeah.
the mounds of America, which seem to predate a lot of even the ancient world that we care about, kind of they've got a gift shop and they get like an exit off the highway,
Yeah.
but they don't have the same sort of repertoire, and they don't command the same gravitas of saying, I'm in Ohio or I'm in Pennsylvania doing excavation versus, oh, I'm in the ancient world, I'm in Egypt right now.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of suppressed information, the land beneath our feet right now is loaded with untold history and history that has been largely covered up. I mean, you said Göbekli Tepe. What comes to mind for me is there's a site here in Tennessee that dates back to being as old as Göbekli Tepe. It's a site in Tennessee where some of the oldest humans inhabited. The only thing is, it's at the bottom of Tellico Lake because in 1979 they put a dam in and flooded that whole valley.
Hmm.
There's an ancient site down there, and not only that, there was whoever these ancient people were, they established their presence there. Then other groups of people, like the Cherokee, come in there and inhabit this area. It becomes sacred ground. It's uh, it's a shame that it's underwater because it would be a great place to go and visit and check out the gift shop, but it's all underwater. I mean, it's adjacent to a site called the Ice House site because what they were doing was they had the knowledge and insight to pick out huge pieces of ice out of the frozen river and move it and put it in a hole in the ground because the ice, once it's in the ground, stays ice, and they could store food that way for long periods of time. These were smart people. The ancient knowledge is off the hook with these people. Just what we don't know half of what they knew or were capable of. And I don't know where I'm going with that, but I think it's a testament to this piece of the puzzle that we are missing out on when it comes to this ancient history and stuff. That whole Tennessee River down there, there were Cherokee cities down there. This is another thing people don't understand. There's a whole group of Tennessee cities that once were down off the Tennessee River on your way into Chattanooga. People can look it up. It's called Sitico, Sitico. That was it. And modern man comes in, puts the dam in, and now all that's underwater. And I'm gonna try to figure out a way to get back to Paracelsus from that.
Well, I'm wondering, in your mind, is that intentional? Is it just
Yes.
that nobody cared? So they
I'll
were
tell
like,
you why.
we're gonna do it in this spot and we're gonna get rid of this evidence.
It was intentional because of manifest destiny. They didn't, they wanted to be able to move these people out of the way. They wanted their land. So they wanted to be able to either move them somewhere else or kill them off so they could have the land. So they needed them to not appear to be intelligent. They needed them to be savages. They needed them to be just dumb natives. So they in this particular instance, they just covered up the whole thing. All the ancient knowledge that they had is lost now. Now they can say, oh, they were just savages. They were going to kill us. So we had to take their land. And it's not just Tellico Lake in Tennessee. It's this happened all over. I mean, there's another spot in Arizona where they did this. What, the Hoover Dam, I think. I'd have to look back into that. But one of those big major dams that's like a household name. There's a whole ancient civilization underneath the lake there, the man-made lake.
Well, because there's another, I guess, an alternate version that would also work there is that they could have been savages. No offense to any Cherokee, but they could have been savages. They just happened to have built their temples on top of the old temples, the same way that
Mm-hmm.
if you go back to Egypt, right? There's different types of ancient Egypt. There's different dynasties, and at some point, I guess one of the better examples is that you can see there's a stark difference between the architecture at different levels of the pyramids or different levels like the Sphinx, where someone maybe tried to do renovations or there was just inferior methods on top of superior methods, which seems to imply that there were older civilizations that had a better understanding of the materials or a better understanding of the entire process. And then that gets lost, and then someone tries to kind of like carry the torch, but not as well. And I've heard the same thing described with Native Americans, where those ancient mound builders could have been a truly superior, like Atlantean almost. We want to get all sci-fi, but
Yeah.
almost like an Atlantean level form of advancement for their time. And then that gets wiped out, and then new people come in and inhabit that area. So now it's hard to just automatically attribute someone that, oh, you're in that geographic region, you must have inherited all the smarts and all the developments of anyone that's ever lived there,
Mm-hmm.
when it gets really more complicated than that.
Yeah, for the Tellico Lake site, yeah, the Cherokee came in and they built on top of this older civilization, but they weren't just savages because when the Cherokee settled this region, they built cities of their own, and they had buildings and they had paved streets. And there's another site down there at the bottom of Tellico Lake. It's called Tekoya. There are pyramids and mounds down there. So they were civilized. How civilized? I don't know. You know, they I don't know if they had, in Florida, you guys have that Coral Castle. That guy obviously was tapping into something. He figured out how to move these big blocks, and I don't know, it's thought that maybe he was using sound or something like that. But he said he found out some sort of an ancient technique that came from, or that the Egyptians used, or whoever built the pyramids, right? So I do think there are cases of more modern people who have been able to tap into this ancient technology. I don't know if the Cherokee did or not. I have a feeling that they had some knowledge of that, but they weren't just brutes. And you know that that guy from Coral Castle it might be an interesting segue for Paracelsus, because people say that these alchemists, they weren't on to something. People say, oh, that's just crazy, it's heresy, it's pseudoscience. But when you look at guys like this guy from Coral Castle, the more you look into it, the more it does seem like they were onto something. And I do think there was some truth behind what some of these alchemists were doing, because I don't know how you have revolution like these guys had. I don't know how you, if what they were pushing didn't have a truth to it, why would the state and the church be fighting them so hard? You know, like back to these guys who came over here to Pennsylvania. That's all happening in the shadow and influence of this mammoth personality that's Paracelsus. So I think the spiritual alchemical movement of the late 1500s in general is revolutionary, and maybe they were cooking with some, maybe they did find answers in some of these old texts.
Well, I wonder why the Coral Castle guy was like Edward Lead Scotland, or I can't his last name was a little bit complicated.
Mhm.
There's another aspect, like he only worked at night and he only
Mhm.
did this stuff by himself, so there was no one around to observe how he did it. So you would just see the progress, but not really have. This is before you could set up, like a night cam or something, a motion detected night cam to capture him, or like set up a drone.
But what about the 30-ton blocks
I don't know, and
that he moved or somebody moved?
continuously, well, he would continuously hint that he was using magnetic forces. Like he was
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
intentionally obtuse about exactly what he was doing.
Well, and I know there's all kinds of conjecture about that one. Maybe it wasn't the best example, but
Well, no, I think he's a good example for Paracelsus because they both were like notoriously loners. Like they did all of their
mhm.
things in complete secret so that it was occulted by nature, and that kind of invites all of this like, well, what does he really know? Is Ed tapping into the
Mhm.
same like spiritual realm and talking to like one of these Olympic spirits, and the Olympic spirits just like picking up the stones for him and putting them in
Yeah,
place?
right, right. I mean, whatever happened there, and even with Paracelsus, it's like this stuff does come into this realm that is pseudoscientific, unfortunately. I mean, this type of alchemy, it seemed to go well beyond turning base metals into gold. I think, Paracelsus said something like uh alchemy is for the making of gold and silver, but for me, it's not about that. I consider it to be a virtue and power, and that virtue and power comes from medicines and what you can actually do with this technology. Like basically, he was not like looking for riches. He was he said that alchemy is the art of freeing the soul by freeing the body. And he said it's about perfecting the body by perfecting the soul.
And then he took a double shot of mercury. He was like,
Yeah. So I don't know,
but
man. I
I
do.
think the again, I think like one of my main thoughts on Paracelsus is just that he knew all this really deep philosophical, occult, maybe woo-woo kind of
Mhm.
thinking, but he was able to apply all of it into this mundane practice of science and medicine in his modern day. So he could take things that would blow your mind, especially for the time. Like you wouldn't even be able to understand it, but he could use that to, fix a cut or to cure your syphilis or to do all of these things that you didn't have to understand. They just worked. So I think that that's really what kind of makes it unique is that he had this universal, undeniable language that was objective in many ways, that he could prove all his magical, mystical ways of thinking. So you might hear this dude talk for 5 hours and be like, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. But then he can actually heal some major issue, or he can at least point you in the right direction from it. So it's undeniable that he was able to not just learn this stuff, but to apply it in ways that other people couldn't. Again, I get
Mhm.
Nikola Tesla seems like one of the best analogies for this, where he might be in a room with you trying to explain like to him the most simple premise, and it's just flying over your head. But then he's like
Mhm.
holds up a light bulb and he's like, "Look, the light bulb's on, right?" And you're like, "Oh, you know."
Yeah. I think it'd be real easy to take some of this information and just go guru with it. Just go full into like spiritual self-help mode. I think you can find parallels here to like nuances in the human experience, and you can like tweak that into like mystic life hacks. Because I
Well,
think these guys were looking at alchemy as a mechanism for turning, weaknesses into strengths.
Imagine if Paracelsus had charisma, like Jim Jones level charisma.
Right.
Because I feel like maybe that, out of all the vices that he might have had, aside from just always being drunk and maybe he smelled a little bit, I hear, but
Yeah.
maybe if he had just had natural charisma, he could have started like a legit cult and it could have turned into something completely different instead of one of his attributes that history remembers you for is how annoying you were to be around.
He does look like he smelled bad in some of those old renderings.
Well, and he's,
But
dude, I have to imagine drinking mercury probably
oh,
gives you like a very specific olfactory scent, right?
yeah, wow. Just I think for some of these guys, the idea was, especially later, like into subsequent years after Paracelsus' death, I think his followers had more of a sense of this, maybe. But this idea that alchemy permeates your existing theology and takes it to another level. So if you add alchemy to Christianity, you're now dealing with some powerful and potent knowledge. And I do see it as being deeply Paracelsian to kind of go that route, to kind of go this guru route. I think I wouldn't be surprised if, if some of his followers did that. They were about building a more enriched life, not through riches, but I don't know, the thought might be forget about like turning lead into gold for wealth. You can transmute your consciousness and become enlightened. So along with anti-materialism, there's also this like kind of a spiritual power message. And if you look at gold and how it ties into the magnum opus, it's like, I don't know, if you achieve the ability to make gold, do you still need to make gold? Or have you found something more valuable? Was the pursuit itself ultimately more valuable than owning a piece of gold that you made? If the goal is to turn lead into gold or turn your I don't know. You know
This
what I'm
gets all
saying?
woo woo and philosophical on me because also one of the tenets of magic and virtue is intent. So if like what is the
Yes.
intent of wanting to create gold if not for the riches and the fame and the material wealth that would come from that? Like it seems that would be the initial thing that gets you on the path, right? So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
if you know how to make gold, hell yeah, you're making gold. Hell yeah, you're living life in luxury. But I wonder too that if that was always an inside joke where there's one form of occultism and the esoteric and the exoteric where I guess if you go in Christianity is a good one. You go and just look at some random sculpture, some random stained glass window. The exoteric might be the most obvious. Oh, this is a scene from this particular passage or parable, right? But then there's
Hmm.
like the esoteric meaning of okay, well, what ancient religion did they jack that one from? That's kind of the esoteric aspect of it. So I think that the way that this is going is that the esoteric part is already like on the outside. Like they're not actually trying to hide this, but there's this inside joke of saying, "Hey, we're trying to create gold out of base metals." Then you're almost like leading all of the people that are only interested in the superficial and they're only interested in the material. You're leading them on this wild goose chase, almost as like a punishment and an inside joke, but also maybe those breadcrumbs that are leading them on that wild goose chase might end up leading them towards the macro version of that. Like I guess in a Paracelsian way, if he was big on the microcosm and the macrocosm, then maybe the micro is the superficial and the macro is applying it to something beyond those. But I mean, to answer a rhetorical question, yeah, if you knew how to make gold, regardless of how deep, spiritually you were, or anything, I think that you're making gold at that point.
I know. I know. It's like, were they so, I don't know. Were they so taken by this higher form of alchemy that they're like really into expanding their consciousness and maybe getting in touch with the divine? Were they really that way, or was it just like a flex to say, nah, I
Yeah,
don't
I
care
mean,
about gold.
it's
But I
it's
do,
easy to
right?
flex and say you don't care about it
Yeah.
if you don't actually know how to make it. It's kind of an I would
Yeah.
almost invert the question too, because would you say that if we just go on his time period, right, from the 1550s until the 2050s, right? So over the last 500 years, do you think anyone has been able to reliably create real material gold from base metals? And if so, like where did it all go? Is there like some huge stockpile of gold somewhere?
Mhm.
Is this like where Eeyore Bach, like he found out how to transmute sperm into gold and like he just buried it all?
I don't know, man. Nicholas Flamel in Paris, he came up with all this money seemingly overnight. He was very into the Philosopher's Stone. I mean, he just kind of overnight starts buying up blocks of of city real estate in Paris, and he's got hospitals there. I think he had up to like 13 or 14 hospitals that he established there, and it just kind of just happened for him, and nobody knows where he got his money from. And he's also this famous alchemist. I mean, his tombstone has just all this cryptic, esoteric lettering on it. The whole thing's a big mystery, of course, but it does make you wonder, like, did he figure it out? Did he alchemically find out a way to turn something into something valuable? Because it seems like he did. Nobody knows where he got his money from. And there's buildings in Paris still to this day that are like, uh the Flamel or whatever. They're attributed to him.
I mean, what if, right? What if a gold brick, like a kilo of gold, actually has a soul in it, and that's what makes it valuable, and that's the
Carbunculus.
transmutation, is that you actually have to endue it with actual spirit somehow. And maybe that's the ultimate price, right? You're like,
Oh
are you
man, I
willing
thought I
to?
was the one being woo woo. Dang. Yeah, I mean, and I'll add to this too, along with all this supernatural spiritual stuff that I was finding. You have this supernova. It happened. It happened 30 years after Paracelsus, but essentially all his followers at the time saw these lights in the sky, and it had a profound effect on them. A lot of the guys involved with the Paracelsian Revolution that kicked off after he died, they saw this. Um, One of those people was Johann Buress. He was a part of a group of followers of Paracelsus. He's called the Renaissance rune magician. He studied the occult and looked into mystical secret meanings behind like the Nordic runes. Uh, he's so influenced by the work of Paracelsus that he injects that into his own work. But uh, he saw this supernova event. It's called the New Star Supernova of 1572. And to a lot of these guys, the alchemists of the day, they saw this as like a harbinger of social change. And it was seen by all these Rosicrucian guys too that were into Paracelsus, like Wormulus and Tycho Brahe, uh, Johannes Barres, of course, and then a lot of other followers of Paracelsus. They all see this, and it seems that somehow I couldn't put my finger on it, but somehow this has a place in the revolution that Paracelsus started, and I think it bled into or tied into the idea of space for them, because you take Tycho Brahe, for instance, he watched this through his telescope. So I think it solidified a belief in alchemically harnessing the power of the heavens for him and for other guys. Because, and another interesting tie in here would be their 10 years before this was the celestial phenomenon over Nuremberg. And that's often associated with being a UFO event. So some of these alchemists also saw that and pondered about that, which that is almost like the Phoenix Lights of the Renaissance. But anyway, all these guys are also into space. That's my point. And I think the medieval alchemists were doing chemistry in conjunction with the sun, the moon, and the planetary cycles. For instance, if you gather dew during like a certain moon phase, because of where the sun is and where X planet is in the sky, that allows for your experiment, whatever that may be. That allows for this planet here, that there, that allows for such and such. Depending on where stuff is in the sky, dictates how they did alchemical magic. And them factoring in the movement of the planets speaks to the complexity of this ritual that some of these guys embarked after.
Well,
And
and Tycho was sort of a punk rocker too in that regard, because
yeah,
part of the things that he was doing was trying to disprove the conventional idea of like Aristotelian astronomy where everything was fixed. Like it's always been like that, it's never changing. And these phenomena that he was seeing, these like UFO, I mean, I would consider UFO an unidentified flying object that
sure.
he's witnessing, was starting to establish this evidence and this proof that it is changing, that it's not like a forever static sky, that will like always look exactly the same, and that things kind of move around and shift over time.
Hmm. As far as space goes, I don't think that space is what they've told us, but I think something is there. I mean, I see the planets at night, or at least I think I see the planets at night, unless that's just some tapestry, unless that's like the tapestry of Athena, or whatever road you want to go down with it. I'm confused by how these guys did not seem to be confused by space. It seems like they understood it enough to utilize it. Again, like if you know where Jupiter is next month and how that's going to affect our atmosphere, you have this window of time available for the next part of the experiment, right? It determines how you practice alchemy, where the planet sets in its cycle. If nothing else, it's a testament to perhaps these guys were just that next level. They just not even comparable to our modern day scientists. I do think that to a certain degree, Paracelsus was definitely next level.
Well, and maybe I'm not advocating for this, by the way,
Space, space,
but
space.
no, no, I was gonna say maybe there's something about drinking mercury. Like maybe the quicksilver does something and lets you reach some extra level. Because
Yeah,
even
yeah, yeah.
Tycho also allegedly maybe died from mercury poisoning.
Oh, I
So
didn't know.
yeah, yeah, his death sort of story is really weird. Apparently he was at a party. He was like at a big banquet, and he was having I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit, but this is kind of how I understood it. He's at a banquet and he's having such a good time that he doesn't want to get up and pee. He's got to pee really bad, but he doesn't want to leave the party because it's like it's killing it right now. And his bladder bursts inside of his body and he dies from this ruptured bladder.
Oh my
Although
gosh.
there's also speculation, I mean, it could have been poison. There's also been
Mm,
speculation that he poisoned himself with all the mercury that he
yep.
was also consuming, because he was sort of this protege of Paracelsus in a way, right? So,
Hmm.
but maybe that's the one similarity that we could trace. How many people have ever even looked into this link of who died of mercury poisoning and what did they accomplish during their lives? And maybe you can reverse engineer that into some like lineage of thinking.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of reverse engineering, Mercury was said to be a key component in how the ancient Vimanas flew. The Vedic texts, there are these ancient flying machines known as Vimanas, and it says in there that they flew by Mercury. Mercury was being spun around, and it creates like a vortex or something. It creates this, I think they call it a ferrofluid vortex engine. Essentially, it's alchemical flight, what is described in those Vedic texts. And the fuel source was Mercury. It's Mercury is this very witchy substance. It pops up for me all over the place. The Nazis were obsessed with it.
Well,
I've got,
the ancient Egyptians too. The
yes.
Egyptians were obsessed with it. They used it for like makeup and the same types of things that Paracelsus would have advocated for was just kind of him bringing some of that information over and being like, I wonder if we could do this too. And I think it also ties in with alchemy because even again in Egypt, they knew how to use mercury in order to mine for gold and silver. So that in itself is transmuting one substance for another. If you're using mercury in order to get to gold, even if it's through a mining process, then that's still sort of like an alchemical process.
Yeah. Yeah. Mercury for me just pops up in some of the strangest places. Uh, I was going to say like the the Nazis had I found a couple articles where Norway is one country and I think Israel is another where they found these old U-boats that were sunken at the bottom of the ocean, and the U-boats are toxic because of how much mercury is on board. Tons of mercury apparently. And these governments are having to come in and bury rubble on top of. They're trying to bury it with like concrete and all this other rubble so this mercury doesn't one day escape out into the sea. But what were the Nazis doing with that? They were transporting it.
Well, they
And
were making batteries out of it.
all of it?
Well, some of
Maybe.
it, some of
Some
it
of
for
it. Yeah.
sure, because
Yeah.
they claim that their mercury batteries were superior to all the other types that were being used at the time. They also were using it in I think the gyroscopes and the V2
Hmm.
rockets. So they
Hmm.
had a million different uses for mercury at the top of their list. And even the more mythical the Glock, is
D
that what it
Glock.
is?
That's it.
The
Yeah.
Glock, man, the bell,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
That thing
man.
was also supposed to be absolutely filled with liquid mercury.
Yes. Yes. It's very much the a toroidal field that runs on Mercury. It's a very similar idea to what the Vimanas supposedly ran off of back in the day. And there's a guy named Manfred von Ardeen who worked for the Nazis. Rumor is that he was witness to Die Glock. Colleagues, he told colleagues that he saw it later in life and such. But after the war, Germany swoops in and I'm sorry, Russia swoops in war-torn Germany before the Allies could get to this guy. Russia gets him. They take him back to Russia and have him work for them. And he gets a Stalin Award for the amount of work that he did for the Russians and the achievements that he was able to do over there. And one of the things that his work turned into was taking this toroidal field and developing nuclear fusion out of it. So and it goes back to this work with mercury and this alleged deglock. Deglock, who knows what that was? They were doing something with that. I don't know if it was meant to be a UFO or what, but you know,
Well, they also had a special name for it. Wasn't just regular mercury, apparently. They called it red mercury. This is what the
yes.
Nazis were working with, which if you go with like the alchemical connection here, Edward Kelly was also known to have this red powder, this red dust, which was supposed to have been like a precursor to the Philosopher's Stone. And that's one of the things that John Dee, I think, was obsessed with, that Edward Kelly had claimed to be able to make this special red powder. And that might even be the thing that got Edward Kelly's ears cut off, that he was kind of like toting this around town of,
Yeah.
hey, I've got the magic, powder. But that also, it always makes me think of, is that just like a powdered form, like a version of whatever this red mercury was? I think it was like serum
Hmm.
525 too. That was another name that the Nazis were using for it.
Yeah. And serum is something I think that Paracelsus was very much into in the medicinal form. I mean, he was into what's called spagyrics as a way of extracting like the medical power of nature and turning it into a tincture or a serum. He had this very medicinal alchemical approach to medicine, and spagyrics played a huge part in that. And I think he preferred folk magic and folk practices in medicine over these some of these academic texts of the day. I mean, he liked the kind of medicine that real people practice, and he liked the kind of stuff that had been established in like a community where over long periods of time people were using this as like their tried and true method to heal wounds and illnesses. He liked that stuff as opposed to like the newer techniques of the day that were popular with the medical community, which, you know,
which was the church.
yeah. And it seems to be a similar situation today where they had an institution like Big Pharma, albeit connected to the church, who would profit um, on people's illnesses, and they would put profit and dogma over people. So I think Paracelsus, went up against that, and he went up against this medieval Big Pharma, and I don't think they liked him. I think just like they don't or they wouldn't like him today, they didn't like him then, and it reminds me of something you said earlier where he's out there burning that book in public.
Well, that might make you not like someone too. Like they
Yeah,
just like show up to your house and start burning stuff.
yeah.
Like even if they've got a great point, they're kind of not doing it the right way.
But that was like one of the most popular medical books of the day is one of the ones that he publicly burned. And I see it as like this very dramatic but renegade move, and it got him banned from medical practice in Nuremberg in the late 1520s. So
Yeah, but at that point, his reputation kind of precedes him, and he's probably garnering favor and sort of this rapport with people that he hasn't even met yet. They're like, damn, this dude's punk rock, right? He's
yeah.
standing up to the establishment. He's the guy that I can tell about this book that I got, or he's the guy that I can explain all these experiments that I've been doing that are also incompatible with whatever the establishment is. He's kind of like an OG conspiracy theorist, right? Like an occultist within the time period when everything was occult. He was like too occult for even then in a lot of them. And this might be another straight analogy, but I also kind of see Paracelsus as like a combination of Brothers Grimm
Mhm.
and even like Walt Disney in a way, where they take folks like they
Absolutely.
they take the things that have worked for the people that have been living on their own for hundreds of thousands of years and that modern society is neglected. They're like, oh, that's all bumpkin stuff, that's all folklore stuff, and they see value in it, and then they use it and repurpose it and use it as a vehicle for some other thing. Like for the Brothers Grimm, they were historians, and then they realized at a certain point that the folklore had more value to it than just the clinical history, which was very sterile and fact based and like just names and dates, but that the folklore encapsulated way more of the actual growth of the culture and the things that they represented. So they start focusing just on that. And I think that Walt Disney, in a way, he kind of takes those base learnings and like Paracelsus sees the micro and the macrocosm, and he just says, I'm going to use this thing as a vehicle, just like Paracelsus uses medicine as the vehicle for all these other things that he learns. Walt Disney kind of says, I'm going to use communication and this medium of TV and movies or whatever, but I'm going to take
Mhm.
all of these like folklore sort of like learnings and put it into this. And why not make some gold while we're at it? Like, why not make some money?
Yeah, absolutely. He was a folk magic, medicinal, anti-authoritarian. That spirit too seems to have caught wind and spread throughout Germany and then Europe and beyond. I mean, his followers kind of carried this with them wherever they went. And I think it caught on with the youth and with some of these university students like an underground movement would. And it fueled these guys. It fueled these guys to move to Pennsylvania as well. That's what prompted them to go to another country was the revolutionary spirit of this. I've actually heard scholars refer to Paracelsus as the postmodern writer of the late 1500s. So I thought about that. So for me, when I hear postmodern, I think of Hunter S. Thompson and Philip K. Dick and guys like that. Uh, that puts into perspective for me how much of a free thinking rebel Paracelsus was for his time.
Well, and again, just like in the mundane world of this, he discovers opium as a painkiller to be used for legitimate medical purposes
Mm-hmm.
in the 1540s or something, in the early
Mm-hmm.
1500s, and that doesn't become popularly used until the 18 something. So
Mm-hmm.
300 years it took for someone to be like, "Hey, maybe that guy was on to something," or more likely, someone discovered it and they were like, "I'm the first one to ever discover this. This is wild." You know what I mean?
Yeah. I, for the record, he thought that transmuting base metals into gold was possible, by the way. I found a book called Hermetic and Alchemical Writings. And I was reading through that because it's said to contain some of his, real writings. And the first sentence in there, Paracelsus alludes to making gold and silver. And then it kind of goes through these canons that he developed. Uh, I read through those, it's pretty dense material. When I got to the fourth canon, I found something very interesting. He wrote, whatever is combustible can be naturally transmuted by fire from one form into another, namely into materials like lime, soot, ash, glass, colors, stones, and earth. Those can again be further reduced into many metallic bodies. And furthermore, if metal is burnt, it can or rendered fragile by rust, it can again become malleable by applications of fire. That's dense. But the practice of spagyrics come out of this, which, from what I understand, you take a substance and you burn it and you use its ashes, and the ashes have they contain like very high levels of whatever molecule, whatever medicine you're wanting to use. It's really interesting stuff. It's like you burn something down to where it's almost nothing, but in the process of that, it condenses that
Well,
and
it's
it
the
makes it
same
more
thing as a
powerful.
tincture, the same exact way
Yes.
that and him also being kind of the father of homeopathy,
Mm-hmm.
which is this version where you just dilute something until it's like 1 part per thousand or less than that, and that somehow that increases its effectiveness. This kind of gets into not just being a punk rocker, but he was kind of like a hippy dippy in a little bit way. He's like, "Hey man, let's just like soak these flowers in some spring water and like leave it out in the moon overnight and it'll cure whatever's you're going through right now." Like there was that hippy dippy aspect of it, and I know it seems supernatural, but I guess going back to what I had originally said, like one of the things that makes him stand out was the lack of that supernatural. It's difficult because it's complicated, but it's the way that the church medicine did it. They were kind of doing it as all supernatural without any inkling towards the natural world. In fact, a lot of that early church, they were all about almost like a Gnostic aspect of denying everything material, anything flesh, anything that was made in the physical world, what had this inherent sin and flaw to it, so it could all be discounted. And I think Paracelsus had a slightly more naturalistic look to it, which is emphasized by his use of herbs and mushrooms and like all this holistic medicine, where he didn't completely discount nature. He kind of saw that as one of the missing elements that was, like needed in order to get over to this next line of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was thinking about some of the stuff that I read too, where he was talking about um, naturally transmuting stuff by fire from one form into the other. And he says, stones and earth is one of the things that comes out of that. And I don't know, it's in that fourth canon of his, and in the documentary Ormus, which we've kind of talked about before in other podcasts, we've touched on it. One of the self-proclaimed alchemists in the movie, he was adding salt and lime to water and making this Ormus stuff. And it was after a process that included applications of fire. The substance was made, it was tested then, and it contained gold and silver. In that documentary, this apparently he was able to create trace amounts of gold and silver by, I don't know, using salt, lime, and minerals. But yeah, maybe it's something in the salt or the lime, and after they touch fire under certain steps, they seem to be able to create pieces of gold or silver. But it's a very cursory layman's explanation of something I saw in a documentary, sure, but it's interesting when Paracelsus talks about earth and stones. I wonder if that means like salt or earth that contains natural salts and necessary minerals for being able to actually pull something like this off. It's just a possible connection between these writings on hermetic chemistry of the 1500s that I found in this modern day documentary about 21st century alchemists.
Yeah, I
He,
wonder when Paracelsus would talk about salt, is he mean like a specific one, or is that a placeholder for any type of salt? Was he
yeah,
aware that
right.
you can almost take any sort of chemical and make it a stable salt? Like you can salt almost anything. I don't know. It's he's definitely like leagues beyond where I'm at. So I'm just kind of from the outside poking him with like a really long stick.
Yeah, I mean, in that second canyon, he uh he talks about the positions of the planets and exploring the celestial powers is what he calls it. He says that the closer Jupiter is to the sun or the moon, uh, and the further it's away from like Venus or Mercury, the more silverness or goldness you can achieve in your experiments. So you could really go down a rabbit hole with that because it does get deep.
Well, and this reminds me a little bit of how the Phoenicians were rumored to make that Phoenician purple, or
Hmm.
and
From all the
and
like the oysters or clams or something.
from certain sort of mollusks,
Mollusks.
but they only produce that particular pigment during very specific times of the year that corresponded with full moons. So it seemed like there was like a mystical, magical
Yeah.
element to it. But if you believe in space and you believe in astrological processions and other planets, then also there might be like a very real physical non-woo-woo explanation for why that particular time of year and that particular area would cause this. Because if you try to harvest them at any other time of the year, you wouldn't get either the same color, you wouldn't get the same output. And only the Phoenicians apparently knew where to harvest, how to harvest, exactly what time to do all of this at. So there is something that goes beyond the supernatural or the spiritual, and just like not astrology, what's your star sign kind of thing, but there might actually be, when that planet's there and that planet's there, this is the time to make gold, or this is the time to make silver. There's real precedent that would indicate that could be an accurate statement if you knew how to decode all of the occulted sort of phrasing that's baked into it.
Also, it's like, like the turtles that return to the island of their birth like 2 nights a year, and it's always at the same time, it's always at the same certain moon cycle. And it's like with these mollusks, whatever body chemistry is going on there is probably happening with a specific time of year, which then would coincide with the moon phase. So there's some sort of a connection there with nature and with what's happening in our atmosphere. And it's
And well,
not necessarily like, supernatural.
like Paracelsus too, that particular job, if that was your profession, was milking these sea creatures for their purple hue. Um, Divorce was still looked down upon, even in like the Phoenician culture at that point.
Mm.
But there's actually laws on the books that if your husband had that job, then you could leave him at any time, because apparently it had this I think it involved putrescine somewhere in the process. So you would just smell like the absolute worst decaying dead like sea creature all the time. It would be seeped into your
Yeah.
skin. So apparently you would have been so unbearable to be around that a lot of those guys ended up living in isolation too, which again, kind of like Paracelsus,
Mhm.
this like high level knowledge and being ostracized from the rest of society. Not only does it invite speculation on all like the esoteric and the occult nature, but it also means that it doesn't really get passed down the same way.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like it's not as approachable, specifically if you didn't like the smell that was involved.
Sure, sure. On the note of the esoteric occult stuff, Paracelsus' mom was in the Benedictine order, and that's a religious sect that I would argue has some very interesting ties into alchemy because hundreds of years before the time of Paracelsus, that order included a guy named Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a reformer who helped start the Knights Templar. So I see him as there's all sorts of indication that Bernard was into alchemy and that he brought all this money into the Benedictine order. And there's a lot of mystery associated with that. He was one of the first guys to, I think, spearhead at least the construction of the Gothic temples. And I think that they included a lot of mystical ideology into the construction of the Gothic temples. I think there was all sorts of esoteric hidden meanings in the architecture itself, and they're working with sacred geometry on top of that. And he's a co-founder of the Knights Templar, so he's in this Benedictine order that Paracelsus' mom is also in. Just an interesting connection.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that before. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it goes it goes all over the place. You know, right when you think you're taking like a hard turn and you're about to run into a wall of science, you're watch out because the esoteric's going to be right there. You know, it's going to be the mystical is going to be right there, the supernatural is going to be right there, just reminding you, I'm still here. That seems to be my journey with this. Like little every little side road I took, every exit off the highway I took led me back to something that was either esoteric or head scratchingly supernatural.
Another maybe a parting thought on this too, because it sounds like we're starting to wrap up a little bit.
Yeah.
I always wonder this to put it in context. Would How different would the world have been if Paracelsus had been cyberbullied as a kid? Like, imagine that, someone was like, haha, Paracelsus, is an intersex, and they post it on like an ancient MySpace, whatever. How different does that make the rest of it? What if he had a calculator in his pocket at any given time? Like so many different what ifs where you mentioned that the guys that figured out how to take a chunk of ice and put it in the ground elsewhere and it could keep the ground cold, and they were like Renaissance men and had to
Mhm.
know all of these advance in life sort of saving techniques, but how much of that was ingenuity born out of necessity, right? Like the things that Paracelsus was encountering, some of it might have been through what seemed like necessity because there was no other alternative to it. And even
Mhm.
though he was bucking the system, it seemed like he was bucking the system in ways that he just knew objectively he had a better answer to. But
Mhm.
again, what if he had a calculator in his pocket from the day he was born? What if he got cyberbullied? Like, would that would that erase everything that would make Paracelsus be a Paracelsus? And I guess Nikola Tesla too. What if as a kid, everyone knew that he had OCD and just got teased endlessly for his OCD? Does
Mhm.
that change? Do we no longer get sort of like DC? Do we no longer get direct
Yeah.
current because of that?
Yeah. I mean, if his mom is or was Knights Templar, what does that say about his social structure? You know, was he born into a more wealthy family and did he go to a private school because
I
of
think he was
that?
like
And
middle
okay.
class-ish. And in
Hmm.
fact, him growing up might have been the height of his wealth, aside from when he got a pretty cush job at the University of Basel, which he's, subsequently just completely threw out by challenging everything they knew and burning their books. I think that that was probably the most financially successful he ever was in his entire life, even sort of like rapport wise.
Hmm.
That was the moment. And then as soon as I believe like physical altercations, he gets into physical altercations at the university. He gets kicked out, probably like bouncer style. He probably got thrown out physically. From there on, he never really improves his social standing. He kind
Yeah.
of dies the same way a lot of geniuses do, penniless and alone and sort of without a whole lot of credit until posthumously people start attributing their huge like sort of findings to him, and then he kind of retroactively becomes a folk hero in some of those ways. But yeah,
Hmm.
no, he was just like a Tesla, man. He kind of dies penniless and alone.
Yeah. But posthumously, it didn't take long for people to pick up the torch. I mean, people were, even in his lifetime, I think, even some of these people involved in this weird book I found, this Arabatel of Magic, seems like he had somebody or worked with somebody who wrote that. So it seems like, and they mention him in a very positive light in that book. So whoever wrote that book was already a follower of him. And then when he dies, not long after that is when you have the spillover of his doctrine into the young minds of these revolutionary college kids, right? So it doesn't take long for this stuff to catch fire and spread, and there's just a lot of material too.
Well, when you mentioned when we started that not a lot of people even know what to attribute to the real Paracelsus versus like neo Paracelsus, like and like some of his students or maybe some of his colleagues that came out and just attributed their writings to Paracelsus. It's almost like one of those Platonic ways where like who knows if it was New Plato, Neo Plato, or Old Plato, or so many people took those reins and just kind of used it because they kind of got their inspiration for whatever they were writing from the man, so they kind of give him all the credit for it.
Hmm. I love that he's anti-authoritarian. That's a big takeaway for me here. I like that he liked the folk medicine and that he was doing all this work with the spagyrics. I think there's maybe still some groundbreaking ideas there with
You
that
think he was
stuff.
drinking pee? You think he drank pee?
I wouldn't put it past him at this point.
No, I wouldn't either.
If you drink mercury, the bar is low.
Yeah. Imagine, yeah,
uh,
imagine like, oh, I'm not drinking that crap, and you just another shot of mercury.
yeah, I mean, it's there's unexplored, unconquered. There's a bit of a theological frontier here that still has yet to be tapped into, because I think a lot of his work has yet to be translated into English. I think it's still either in German or Latin. And so that means a smaller amount of people on the globe have been exposed to his work. So even if you're listening today and you're into alchemy and stuff, if you want to explore some untouched material, it's out there. Like, there's some stuff that you could translate into English that maybe people who speak English have never even heard. So I mean,
It was my entry. Paracelsus was my entry point into alchemy outside of thinking it's just all about summoning demons and creating gold or like whatever you get from Full Metal Alchemist or any
yeah.
other, Hollywood version. When I actually started writing, I think the collection of the book was just called Collected Writings from Paracelsus. But it has this odd form of like logic and reason to it because he kind of explains, or whoever wrote it and attributed to him, they kind of write out some of the logic behind it, which makes sense in a 500-year-old way, or more than that, right? But
Hmm.
it kind of makes sense in that way, which is completely different than almost anything. It was almost like a Manly Palmer Hall style of writing that was the best. And I think that maybe even Manly Palmer Hall is where I originally heard the name Paracelsus to even look that up. But the same way that Manly Palmer Hall was known for making a lot of this woo-woo high-level stuff way more accessible to just a regular person, Paracelsus's writings also kind of have that same tinge to them. Although I don't think that his writings were necessarily widely accessible to normies in his day. but just the way that he thought and the way that it was written, or at least the way that it was translated into English that I read it
Mm-hmm.
from, it it has way more of the explanation and the fine details that I'm not used to seeing, where some of them are just like, again, you just have to believe, Luke, just believe in the Force. And you're like, oh, great, thanks. Awesome. I'm glad that I read this whole book.
Some of the stuff that I came across, some of the material that I found said in the first couple lines, it kind of alludes to like the first rule about this material is that you don't discuss this material. There's a
Fight Club, yeah.
the Fight Club, there's a big emphasis on being able to keep a secret with some of this. So maybe this stuff isn't meant to be put on blast.
Well, and that's why
And,
I still think that his mentions of pygmies and fairies and salamanders could very well be this, because Isaac Newton did the same thing too, right? Isaac Newton's
yeah.
writings had all sorts of alchemical, but people were able to reverse engineer and be like, oh, this wasn't all just silly like Sky Daddy nonsense. These were real chemicals that he just had like a cipher built out for.
Yeah. I think some things too just hit differently depending on where you're at with your journey. And, I looking at Johannes Calpius and his reaction to Paracelsus, I I do see this conversion happening where his like personality almost changed when the alchemy shows up, right? I think some people get into it and it almost takes over and they convert to this new way of thinking about the world around them. I think Paracelsus has been a vehicle to that for many people. He's been a harbinger of revelations for people. And, even Carl Jung, I think too, when he discovered alchemy in his 50s, he dedicated the rest of his days to the study of alchemy. He was a convert. So this information has very powerful implications on, you know, what you decide to do with it. So we can probably wrap it up.
Yeah, I think
What do you think?
once you bring Young up, it's like, okay, that's the curtains closing.
Yeah, yeah. And plus, I mean that to go into Young right now, it's too late in this show because it's like either opening up a new door or like what you say, it's like the curtains are closing.
Well, yeah, let's just do a quick 2-minute recap of the Red Book.
Right, right. Uh, and this was great. It's always great to talk alchemy and other things with you, whether it's esoteric or we're just having fun with some of these concepts. It's always great, man. And I'll just go ahead and kick us off with the plugs. Why don't you tell everyone where they can find you?
You can find me and all the crazy things that I do at paranoidamerican.com. I've been publishing comic books for over 12 years. I started it while I was working at Disney. I was there for 10 years doing animation. So I basically took everything that I was doing for In the Belly of the Beast, and now I'm trying to apply it to conspiracy theories and occult research. And a great example of that is something called the Homunculus Owner's Manual, which is a little mini comic that I made with Juan Ayala from the One on One podcast. And it breaks down pretty much every historical, philosophical, celestial, magical version of what a homunculus is. It goes into detail on Paracelsus. It goes into detail about a whole bunch of different aspects. It even brings it all the way into modern day where we talk about Jack Parsons and even Jeffrey Epstein. Maybe Jeffrey Epstein was making a modern version of what Paracelsus kind of defined as the original homunculus. It's got Crowley, it's got everything you could imagine. So yeah, if Paracelsus seems even vaguely interesting to you, you should absolutely check out the Homunculus Owner's Manual, and you can get that on paranoidamerican.com.
Cool. I'm Tim Constantine. My podcast is Six Sensory Podcast. I don't use the number six. I spell it out SIX. Six Sensory Podcast on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and you can find me on Instagram. And as always, it's been a pleasure. Thomas, I appreciate this. And to everyone listening, thanks for listening.